Let's do it.
We good? There we are.
I
We're
think
good.
we're good.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to put a pin in what we were just talking about, who knows how things are gonna pan out and where the best place to be is. I think a lot of us right now are kind of playing that arbitrage game if we can, if we have that degree of adaptability or flexibility. And it seems like that's the way to go. Because I mean, the States seems like one of the best places to be. And I know a lot of people, maybe a lot of non-Bitcoin or normie people would find that absurd because a lot of people are, I don't know, afraid of it or think it's going down the tubes or something. But I mean, that's the state of the world, right? I mean, how many places are at least preserving your right to speech and your right to self-defense and these sorts of things? There's not many places. I mean, that's another thing. You brought up Bill C-11, but in Canada, they just did another big gun grab. And I think,
oh, really?
Yeah, at the last hour, they made some, because Trudeau had already done, I mean, it's all so crazy, but like in response to a shooting, I think in the East Coast, like a year or two ago, by a guy who acted like he was a police officer, put the stickers on the car, the whole 9 yards, but got illegal guns from the US, right? So they weren't registered, they weren't bought in Canada, have nothing to do with Canada's gun laws whatsoever.
Right.
But in the name, that was used to do a big gun grab. And I think like most non-hunting firearms were made illegal, handguns, all that kind of stuff. There was a big buyback thing. And this one, so a year or two later, was basically, coming after a huge swath more, like a lot of hunting style rifles. And I think at the last hour, they made a few concessions. And so they allowed people to keep, a few different variations or whatever it was. But it's clear that, they want to take guns away from Canadians. And, there are a lot of hunters in Canada, but there's a lot more normies. And, the normie position in Canada is, why the hell would you want a gun?
Right.
I mean, there's absolutely no appreciation for the role of the citizenry to be able to defend themselves, both defend like their own family against individual attackers and stuff like that, because the police aren't usually Johnny on the spot, right? They can follow up later and maybe try to get some justice. And there's even less appreciation for the notion that it's a check and balance on, the power of government. I mean, that's just not part of the Canadian consciousness whatsoever. And so most people are very, very supportive of getting guns off the streets, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's sad to see. And I mean, the States does have a lot of problems, but I think that there's at least mimetically kind of a groundswell of an appreciation of sort of the mythology of freedom. And even if, in many cases, the Republicans and the Democrats both, frequently disappoint many people, including myself. But at least kind of within the Republican wing, you see at least aping the freedom narrative. And, I like seeing that more than I don't. So
totally.
We still have a bit of that here. The access to natural resources is pretty good. And I think that's going to be something that at least will give me peace of mind over the coming years, is I'd really like to, work out in good detail where my food's coming from, where my energy's coming from. I've been playing with solar a little bit. I have sitting next to me a little, the makings of an off-grid solar inverter battery setup. And
I saw the photos that you tweeted out a couple of days ago.
Yeah, it's been fun to play with. I mean, I don't think that's a substitute for good baseload energy, like you might get from a nuclear solution, but I think they're good for different things. And if you want to actually do decentralized energy, kind of on an individual household level, solar is a pretty appealing way to do it, especially because they're subsidizing the hell out of it.
Yeah, totally.
At least here.
And the US has that notion of like the rugged individualist sort of thing in its history and consciousness. And I think that also contributes to it all. I mean, I hate to shit too much on Canada because I love the land and some the people where I'm from.
Love Canada.
Yeah, I mean, there's good things about it, but in terms of like the national consciousness, freedom just isn't there's so much there's just a taken for granted of what prevails up there. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I say that somewhat cautiously, because what prevails up there now is not a great picture, but you know what I mean? Like what historically has been available there in terms of freedom and prosperity, there seems to be very little appreciation for how that is generated and maintained. You know, people just
Mm-hmm.
assume, oh, we're Canadians, like this is what we do. We're peaceful and we're prosperous and we're free. And people don't realize that you get those things as a result of upholding certain values and principles and not wavering on them. And to the
That's
extent that
right.
you waver on them, you lose those things. And there's just, I think a lot of people up there just think the status quo self generates, like the good part of the status quo, let's say, like the things that we would probably agree on, just happen by like an accident of fate. And they don't really, it's not something you have to be consciously aware of or vigilant about, which, is usually the attitude that prevails before things kind of go to shit. So
That's right. And, maybe that explains the efficacy of that fourth turning framework. If you have prosperity and a sort of libertine organization to society, if you're born into that,
right,
and that was there for your parents' generation, you assume that that's the natural state, and it's
yeah.
like anything but, right? So I
And
do
you can
think
be
that people,
forgiven for that. I mean, because like, why
right,
wouldn't you think it's the natural state? But
right,
and I think the answer to that is it's critical that you're educated on how things come to be as they are, because then you have a frame of reference for like where things could go. And not only does that not really prevail in Canada, but people are being fed the exact opposite of that. They're being fed things that contribute to the degradation, ideas and things like that that are divergent from, in my opinion, what would be necessary to soberly assess the circumstance, understand how things came to be as they are and how they could be improved, and then direct your attention and energies in that way. I mean, it's the complete opposite. People are more feeding into the very things that exacerbate that taking for granted sort of attitude. And, of
mm-hmm,
course, we're seeing the results of it today.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Canada, much like Australia, maybe you could lump Japan in here. It's almost like there's peacetime mode of organization where you have high cohesion, and everybody's just trying to be a good neighbor, be considerate, do the right thing, from kind of a top down perspective. And that in most cases that creates like a very stable, nice environment where people are just go along, get along. There's high cohesion in society. But I think, and people subconsciously realize this in America, I think, there is another mode, which is kind of the American volatility mode, where it's like, yeah, there are guns and there are shootings, and there is maybe an inbuilt distrust of government, but that serves to actually almost hedge you against these kind of civilizational risks, where you might have a defect. It's like growing, the world's wheat crop from a single germ. It's like, you need some dissonance, you need some decentralization of power to actually offset these civilizational tides that can kind of come along and just wipe you out. So we may or may not be in one of those. Who knows?
It kind of seems like it, right? I mean, a lot of people have talked about the various converging cycles right now, but I agree with that assessment. And in Canada, I don't know. There's such a an issue like the gun issue, right? I mean, the narrowness of thinking is always what kind of drives me crazy. It's like, and you could the same could be true for the States. I mean, there's probably a better example because there are all these horrible, shootings and tragedies and stuff like that. And the reflexive, the overly simplistic, narrow reflexive response is, oh, what did the damage? The guns. Get rid of the guns. The problem will be resolved.
Right.
And it's just such a insane way to look at these things. And you're not balancing the benefits with the risks or the downsides. And I mean, it's the nature of the discourse generally in society today. But kudos to you guys for holding out this far, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think, I've heard maybe Switzerland and Panama have like kind of liberal gun laws, but I don't think they're even close to the US. And, whether that's from a genuine recognition of the role of, an armed citizenry in providing that check on the balance of power of the government, or if it's like just America and you just instinctively love guns for a lot of people, or enjoy, using firearms or whatever. Probably a little bit of both, but it's kind of the last bastion of, the last country that's kind of recognizing the importance of that.
That's right. And like I said, I think there's kind of a subconscious realization of that, even maybe among people who don't even own firearms. Maybe there's a kind of like, well, we're really the last holdout, and maybe you want to preserve that just in case.
Totally. Well, I think it seems like during all like the height of the COVID craziness, I mean, it seemed like a lot of people like that were formerly anti-gun had become pro-gun. And I think part of that was just like, oh, this can happen. And maybe you even agree with everything that went down, or these people probably disagreed with it to some degree, but just the blatant power and of the government to execute on these policies was just in everyone's faces. And I think that just added to, made people question like, oh, well, what if this is, that power is directed in another way in the future, and should I not want to have some means of opposing it? And I think, you had, I think the guns and ammo and stuff were hard to find for a while. And, a lot of so-called liberals or lefties ended up becoming center right politically or philosophically speaking. So, maybe this American revivalist sort of narrative has some legs, and if we can mix in a little Bitcoin there and shrink the government, then, maybe there's a second inning for America, and it's not time for China to take over everything.
I sure hope so. Yeah, I sure hope so. I mean, the internal discord definitely does get tough for someone living here, but I think you are seeing kind of a maybe not unlikely coalition. But we know some ranchers out here in Virginia, and they're really big on Bitcoin for all the same philosophical and kind of design reasons that that we are fundamentally. And so I think you're seeing these coalitions start to emerge across, people who are like, for lack of a more concise, for lack of a more descriptive way of putting it, who are acquainted with ground physical reality. You have people who are farmers, ranchers, you have people who are generating energy, who kind of get, okay, like none of this just shows up. And I think that fosters this appreciation that you don't get something for nothing. And what we've been doing with the monetary policy for the last 30 plus years here has basically been something for nothing, or an attempt to pursue that. So I do think you're seeing Bitcoin start to provide kind of a framework for people from a lot of different walks of life to come together and say, we object to the way that this system has been going, and we want to create something different.
Yeah. For people like that, I assume, but again, correct me if I'm wrong, because a lot of the perception of Bitcoin up till now has been, pump your bags, right? Make a bunch of money. And it seems to me that, and I'm too deep in this to really have an objective view, but it seems to me that the perception is more becoming that element of kind of independence or sovereignty or an ability to opt out. It's like the craziness has just been on such full display the last 2 years, all the different ways, whether it be energy, food, money, that I can extricate myself from the madness. I want to do that. And if you're telling me that Bitcoin is the best way to do that for my finances, I'm interested. And then you do your research and you determine for yourself if that's a valid way to do so. But it seems like, and that's, in my opinion, that's obviously a much more healthy narrative, because I think that's much more what it's all about, right? I think that is the genuine value proposition of Bitcoin. And so it seems like, and there's been, these ranching initiatives and meat initiatives, and it's great that people that are of like mind like that are coming together, and the ranchers are getting orange pilled and the Bitcoiners are getting, the nutrition and the sustenance and the food supply that, exactly. And I mean that I said opt out, but the term I prefer is because I mean, depending on how long you've been thinking about, the society is fucked up narrative, the answer has always been to like get out of Dodge, right? Like go up into the mountain or go to the beach or just get out of the madness. And while I can certainly understand that and have and am kind of pursuing that approach in my own life, um, opting out is not a very engaging attitude. It's like rejecting the world. You're like, fuck it all. It's too crazy. Get me the hell out of here. But I don't think that's the mindset that we're supposed to have. Like that doesn't cause you to, to think about new ideas and to engage new ideas and to try to build and create and all that kind of stuff. I think the opt-in attitude is way more creative. And I think a lot of people are starting to realize that what Bitcoin initially seems like an opt-out. And of course, this is kind of just semantic difference because it is, but it's much, I think it's much more helpful, and it really does represent an opt-in, because when you opt into Bitcoin, you see all the discourse that's happening. It becomes super intellectually stimulating. You learn about a bunch of other stuff. You meet a bunch of like-minded people. You start changing your life in certain ways. Like and you basically become a part of that so-called parallel economy. And it's that very parallel economy that ends up out competing and starving the thing that you were previously opting out of. That's the hope, right? That it just ends up winning out in the end, however long it takes. And that's how we kind of shift from the dumpster fire of now to the bright orange future.
That's right. And, there's no geographical frontier. I mean, yeah, I guess we could all go up to the Yukon or, down to the South Pole or something, but that's not going to happen. And so the frontier really becomes kind of a virtual frontier, or it becomes, maybe a shifting back into the rural, or trying to find a new place kind of within the borders. But what you're saying is so true about Bitcoin opening doors. I mean, the only reason that I started fooling around with the solar stuff is because a buddy of mine sent me an old S9 and he said, "Hey, these things are real cheap. I just want you to play with this," and I hadn't myself done anything serious with mining. And so I set this thing up in my house, and I'm sitting there, I've underclocked it, and it's churning away hashing for some pool. And I think, oh man, this is really cool. I really like doing this. I like being a part of it. But I, pencil out the numbers in terms of what I'm paying per kilowatt hour for electricity, and it just makes no sense. I'm lighting money on fire. But I say, oh, if I could actually produce energy, what would that look like? Could the solar thing kind of pencil out? So I mean, Bitcoin in many ways was really the impetus for me to start investigating, how energy is produced. And I think it's very much true what you're saying, that to convince yourself of Bitcoin's efficacy, admittedly, if you're a curious, skeptical person, you've got to get up to speed on a lot of different stuff. And I think that can be an amazingly gratifying process for a lot of people that brings people together in new ways.
Totally. The world is kind of, well, everything's fresh and new with this one little change in your perspective, and it's amazing that it can have such a profound influence. And in I often talk about also in the attempt to understand, so-called understand what Bitcoin is, you find yourself having to consult like a number of different fields, from technology to energy to philosophy, like wherever. Now some are more drawn to one versus the other, but the point is kind of like, this thing seems so novel that to get the proper context to, again, air quotes, understand it, you end up having to go in so many different directions, and you end up having to go so deep into all those directions. And I think that's what makes the realization, if I can call it that, of Bitcoin so profound, is because, like you go off in all those different directions, and then you try to find your way back to how your newfound knowledge in those areas help you understand Bitcoin more. And that just exacerbates the process. This is kind of like the mind-blowing nature of the trip down the rabbit hole, because it never ends. And and it, as you say, I mean, amongst other things, it's just very gratifying. It's very intellectually stimulating. And I think, one of my experience was, I'd always been curious, but the perception of the world was that it was super messed up, and that doesn't really inspire you to pursue those things. Not only do you may not have the security around the future, and therefore, you don't feel like it's a good use of time, but you're also, there's an aspect of nihilism that creeps in. You're like, well, what's the point? Like,
yeah, what can I do?
Whatever. But when that gets turned around, then, the world becomes relevant again, if I can put it that way, or more relevant than ever.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also have this tool to kind of probe it more deeply, and to give you the security and the comfort and the confidence that the future is going to be there as something to engage. And therefore, all that probing is even more relevant, and that seems to be what's happening to a lot of the people that are way down this rabbit hole. Is like their lives are being changed by just kind of coming alive, by being invigorated with the inquiry, the search, the education, the wanting to contribute, the wanting to engage, and it's just, I'm always blown away by how positive it is. I speak to a lot of so-called plebs or not famous Bitcoin people on this show, and
Mm-hmm.
it's always so amazing just you can see the look in their eyes, like whatever their situation was. Usually there's some sort of like hero's journey element of the story. Things weren't so great career-wise, financially, emotionally, psychologically, all that kind of stuff. And this thing has been the catalyst for changing all that around. And now there's just this tremendous enthusiasm for what can be. Mm-hmm. And, mm-hmm. If people around the world today are looking for, something to fix these gargantuan problems that we perceive to have, or that they might, perceive exist, what could be better than something that causes that effect in people? That seems to be the thing, not whatever policy you're lobbying the government to enact or whatever. Like that type of change on an individual level seems to be it. And, it's just so awesome to see it.
I think there's a profound shift in how someone looks at their own life. If you take something as fundamental as how am I saving my value? How am I protecting what I work for? And am I seeing the fruits of my labor build towards something? And it's harder than ever, man, to get that in kind of the world. I look at house prices around me, and it's staggering. I mean, yeah. I make good money doing software stuff, and it's like the prospect of getting a single family home for myself, my family, like that's increasingly like getting out of reach. I'm just like, man, if I didn't have a highfalutin white collar job, like what the hell would life look like? So if you can, if Bitcoin, I think really almost in that it's it's very unstable in terms of its exchange rate, but it gives you kind of a new basis to look at how you're saving, how you're accruing value. And I think that can be very empowering for someone, because if they feel like, okay, yeah, I'm setting a little aside in this Bitcoin thing, and maybe I'm actually working towards something. Maybe I'm, going to have some value that's actually kind of building. I think that's a big shift for people. But then from, the intellectual curiosity standpoint, I can say, having been in Bitcoin now, I mean, I started working on Core in 2015, 7 years ago now, which is crazy. But I'm still feeling invigorated on a regular basis about things that I find. I've loved watching this Nostr product emerge. I mean, really protocol emerge. And I was looking the other day at like getting onto Nostr and what that process looks like. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to get the app on my Android phone, and I know I have to generate a key pair, and so I'm going to generate a key pair, but I don't want to put that key on my phone because I don't really trust my phone that much if this is my social identity. So we should have this notion of like subkeys in Nostr. And I'm like, oh, well, this thing is just getting born. It's under active development. I can go and like work on this and actually, help devise a way to do this subkey approach. Like, and so I think, and you're talking about something as fundamental as potentially rewiring, how digital socialization happens. And there's like plausibility behind that possibility. And I think Bitcoin's very, very similar, where you're like, wow, I could be in the middle of the rebirth of the monetary system, and I can actually play a part in this. And I can, have my feet on the ground. Like how incredible that could be, kind of whatever your skill set is, like even just, downloading a wallet and like transacting in UTXOs. It's very possible that 50 years from now, if you've sent an on-chain transaction in Bitcoin, like it's very possible that your descendants are going to be like, no, you didn't. You're full of shit. Like you didn't send a Bitcoin transaction. Nobody does. Like it could be that scarce a thing. So even just kind of like showing up and getting acquainted with, the technology and what's going on, I think is very invigorating.
Totally. And you sometimes, it's easy to forget that you could be smack in the middle of like one of the biggest historical moments in human history. I mean, I'm definitely one of those people that gets hyperbolic about Bitcoin and its implications. And, I make no bones about that. I mean, that's what I feel drawn to, and, people can take it or leave it. But if that is the case, it's pretty crazy that we all, as you say, have the capacity to engage it in some manner. I mean, everyone in different ways. And, as you just said, like maybe just in very simple ways of using it early, using it to foster more stability and security in your life, and to avail of all the benefits that just those two things alone engender. When people, and I think a lot of this happens on a subconscious level. People don't necessarily realize that, they're being stolen from their fiat savings balances, let's say. But there's like there's this underlying anxiety that induces that deprivation, as you said. I mean, like the price of things going up and your purchasing power not rising in tandem with that. I mean, it's just a growing anxiety. Like the world is less available to you, less and less and less and less, and you have to work more and more. You have to give away more in your time, and I think that means your conception of the future is going to be dramatically different. Like, oh well, can I afford that home? Can I afford the family? Can I do these things? And it just causes you to shrink into yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're seeing that all over the place today in whatever it is, in social unrest, or in, diseases of despair, so-called, like, depression and that kind of stuff. I mean, drug abuse, substance abuse. I mean, it's crazy how many like people are dying annually in the US from like the fentanyl opioid thing. I mean, that just doesn't get any press. And it's like, it's over a Vietnam every year in terms of its death toll. It's like, and how much of that, I mean, again, lots of causes, of course, but there's this sense that the future is there's less and less future, right? And people just withdraw into the moment, and whatever their thing is, it kind of destroys them. And I think Bitcoin just turns that right on its head and starts to give you a notion that the future could be better, and also a tool for helping you to, build brick by brick toward that. And as you do that, your confidence grows, you start expanding outward. You start expanding into new social relationships. You start expanding into new intellectual journeys, expanding into new, however you deploy your time and energy, capital, work, career, entrepreneurship, that kind of stuff. And that's what makes people feel the most content. That's where the people feel the most happy. It's not that you're not happiest when you don't have anything to do. You're happiest when you have meaningful things to do with people that you're aligned with. I mean, there's nothing better than that. It could be the shittiest work in the world, but it's like, if you feel that it's it's contributing to something meaningful, and you're the people with whom you're doing it are on a similar mission. I mean, that's what generates the best camaraderie. That's what generates the best, feeling of accomplishment. And like, to bring it back, I mean, if we are in the middle of such a profound change, or if we're at the beginning rather of such a profound change getting going, I mean, it's kind of hard to think about that. I don't think we can extricate ourselves sufficiently from the situation to really appreciate that. But I mean, I guess the only reasonable response is gratitude. It's like, holy shit, wow, we get to be here now for this. And to your point, I think, like, perhaps more than anything, that's one of the primary impetuses for calling you forth to something grander, like trying to extract something greater out of yourself than you might have previously expected of yourself. It's like, wow, like, if you're really here at this time for something of this magnitude, maybe you should, maybe it inspires you to be more than you previously had expected yourself to be, in whatever domain that
make the best use of the time you have. While this stuff's going on.
Yeah. And it seems like that's the case. So happy days. Speaking of work and meaningful work, one of the reasons why I wanted to speak with you today is obviously around the work you've done with vaults and putting forward that proposal. And there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about things like that. And even more broadly around just changes or upgrades to Bitcoin and how we should be thinking about them. I spoke with Lop a week or two ago around this topic, and I just feel like it's probably insufficiently covered. I mean, it seems to me it's very opaque. Like, you know, a lot of your average Bitcoiners will just kind of, you know, the people in the know, like the gray beards or the devs, you know, there's a lot of deference to their expertise. And
Right.
then you just kind of sit back and wait to see how it plays out socially. And that seems to be the process. And, you know, there's pros and cons to that. I mean, the opaqueness of the rough consensus, the social consensus process is probably a feature, not a bug, because it makes it less co-optable, let's say. But the lack of clarity also means that, you know, well, anytime you lack clarity, you're not in the best position to make an informed decision, you know? So I just wanted to have you on to broaden the scope and, you know, contribute to this conversation about how we should be thinking about this stuff generally. So I don't know if you have a particular place where you want to start, or if you have any comments on that.
Yeah. No, I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of describing the duality between the process not being well defined, let's say, in terms of how, you know, Bitcoin's rules can evolve over time. And, you know, the fact that makes the system resilient, but that it introduces a lot of complexity in terms of, and you know, as you say, opaqueness in terms of how it actually does change. And it's something that I've, you know, kind of had a front row seat to for a little while. And I think it's a little bit misunderstood. I think many people who participate in Bitcoin a little take for granted the way that maintenance has worked, the way that the previous upgrades have worked in terms of Segwit and Taproot. Because really, the reality is, even though, I mean, I think everybody has to be cautious, because even though it's very easy to say, oh yes, Bitcoin is leaderless, and there's no structure, there's no enforced process for how things change. You have to be very careful of the situation you can get into where there is a structure and there are leaders, but they're very implicit, and they're not well understood. And I think that, you know, really we've been in this situation where the last two Softforks, which have been profound, you know, reimaginings in some ways of how things work in Bitcoin. And I think they've been great changes. I'm very happy with both Segwit and Taproot, having been a pretty boots on the ground user of them. But you know, the reality is that those changes have stemmed from a pretty small group of people. And, you know, within the technical community, I think we've kind of developed this implicit, unstated muscle memory of like, okay, well, you know, these guys constructed a change, these guys signed off on a change, it must, you know, it's got to be good. And in reality, these proposals are very difficult to evaluate, and they're very difficult to sort of game out over time, even for people, you know, who have pretty high technical capability. So I think, you know, for the past few years, we've been in this situation where most people agree that Bitcoin needs to change somehow, and or continue to change somehow. And you know, we can have a discussion about whether that has merit or not. Personally, I think, you know, Bitcoin definitely would really benefit from changing in certain ways, even after being kind of risk adjusted for the severity of the changes. So most people agree that Bitcoin has to kind of progress, and the protocol has to move forward in some way. But I think there isn't really like a well-defined path for how to do that when you've basically got, you know, the guy or the group of people who have been really spearheading the protocol for the last, call it 5 years. or maybe more, honestly, when they kind of abdicate that responsibility a little bit, because they say, hey, it's not a good state for us to bring the tablets down the mountain and say this is what it's going to be, because that's not how this can work for perpetuity. And I think you've got very talented, influential people who realize that, and they don't want to be a part of really the consensus change process. So you're kind of in this awkward, the analogy I've used before is like you're sort of in your, wandering the desert for 40 years stage, where there's like a bit of a vacuum in terms of process, and there are still participants, myself among them, but it's not well. There aren't like great conventions for what is social consensus, what is enough. And so it's been interesting to navigate. I mean, my own approach here has been to really narrow what I'm trying to do and to like narrow the proposal, because I think you've seen a lot of people pitch very general changes that are kind of on the nature, in the same nature as Taproot or Segwit, where you're really introducing something that like totally opens up the protocol into this new space. I think people are cautious and wary of those for very good reason, because they're just, the more open-ended the design change, the harder it is to reason about and really kind of assess. And really, my fixation has been on the vault stuff, and we can talk about that in whatever detail you want to, but I really just wanted to see the conversation move in a bit more of a narrowed, tangible direction, towards just being able to more safely custody Bitcoin for everybody. And so that's what I've been up to.
Yeah, we'll come back to that in a bit for sure. But and if you started working on it in 15, then I guess you came in right before Segwit, basically.
Yeah.
But what was the vibe or the mindset or the perspective on changes prior to that? Because I mean, it seems to me we're in a era or period now where it's just de facto sort of, and by the way, I'll preface all my questions here by saying I'm seeking an informed perspective on all this. So to the extent that I, steel man or, represent an opposing view, take it for trying to triangulate in on the right perspective to have. But to what extent, it seems like now we have like this just de facto assume like soft forks happen every so often, and we debate, why they happen, if they're needed, or if there's just a great opportunity or what have you. Prior to Segwit, was that kind of the understanding, or, was Segwit done because it had to be done in that way? And has the approach changed as a result of that, of having normalized changes and upgrades in this way, whereas prior to that, were they less considered, or were they not, I think you know what I'm trying to say. Were they not kind of in the scope of how to treat this thing?
Yeah, I think that the history before Segwit's really worth revisiting, because you saw a few soft forks happen before Segwit that really happened much more casually. Not a huge fuss was made about the activation of like check lock time verify, check sequence verify, a few others. This just kind of rolled out, and because they were more narrow changes to Bitcoin than like, I mean, Segwit's like a total overhaul. Taproot to some extent is like a total overhaul. But prior to Segwit, you have the combination of the proposals just being more tightly scoped, but then you have the fact that like the genesis of Segwit, as well as the deployment process, was just like fraught with drama. The whole reason that Segwit, part of the motivations with Segwit was, of course, the block size, and the idea that blocks were filling up, and we needed to address some kind of capacity improvement somehow. But also, you had a kind of like unrelated concern, which was this idea of transaction malleability, and that you couldn't really do Lightning, or you could do Lightning, but it would be very ham-fisted if you didn't have this stable transaction ID scheme. So I just think Segwit kind of like peed in the punch bowl a little bit in terms of like, wow, it's this software process is like really excruciating. It's really dangerous. You know, you're going to introduce, you know, cataclysms, when really, you know, the Softforks that preceded it were pretty casual. You know, I mean, pay to script hash was a pretty major revamping of how Bitcoin works. I still wouldn't put it on the same level as like Segwit or Taproot, but it was pretty substantial. And I just think, you know, when that was rolled out, I mean, Bitcoin was a much smaller system, and people just didn't care as much. But, you know, obviously the scrutiny that people put on the change process is probably corollary to the kind of the market cap of the system, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's just gone up over time. So yeah, I mean, I'd really like to see, again, I think there are improvements for Bitcoin, and I'd like to see us consider a mode where we make kind of more tightly scoped changes that have kind of very readily observable value that's easy for people to assess and reason about and say, okay, well, this is the risk, these are the benefits. Whereas, you know, the last two Softforks we've had have been just like massively positive, but massively profound and complicated changes.
How much, like, how much of a distinction do you make between changes that quote unquote need to be made versus ones that, you know, should be made? And in the latter, I mean, kind of in both, but definitely more so in the latter, there's absolutely an element of whoever is proposing that change presuming to further define Bitcoin, right? Like Bitcoin is X right now, let's say, and it should be X plus Y. And that I would say is more so the case in the latter. So, I mean, how much of a distinction do you make between the reasoning behind changes on those two sides?
Yeah, I think you could come up with three buckets, right? There are changes that like absolutely positively need to be made. Some of them known, some of them unknown. So for example, you know, one of the changes that absolutely positively needs to be made at some point is one of the fields in the block header, you know, past some date is just gonna, you know, not be workable anymore. So, and that'll amount to some kind of a fork. So like that's known, luckily very narrowly scoped. You know, if there was some kind of major cryptographic break at some point that nobody saw coming, like that would be an absolutely positively need to change. Then there's you know, what I would maybe call like the nice to haves, you know, discretionary. You know, maybe you put like say op vault in that category, which is like, yeah, I think it represents, say, an order of magnitude improvement for the users of Bitcoin. You know, anybody who wants to custody coins, you probably get an order of magnitude better solution for doing that. And I think if you want to see adoption by, you know, whether it's like a broadly deployed FEDI network or central banks or just individuals wanting to like make sure they can sleep at night custodying their coins, like I think that's great to have, but is it strictly required? No. And then you've got this like middle category of things that keep me up at night a little bit from a kind of like usage projection standpoint. So the tidbit, you know, I've thrown around recently to a little bit of controversy is this idea that if you wanted to take Bitcoin and do absolutely nothing with the chain, but open a Lightning channel for each person, you know, and let's say that you wanted to onboard 2 billion people, you know, kind of given the current state of Bitcoin, it would take you 2 years to do that. So this idea, you know, that we're going to be able to like facilitate the commerce of the world, you know, there might need to be changes to Bitcoin to make that happen. I'm not asserting that as being totally true, but I'm saying you've got to kind of entertain that possibility. And then another facet of that kind of middle ground is like, not a lot of people know this, but like right now, there are some pretty glaring security vulnerabilities in Lightning that really stem from the way that the Bitcoin peer-to-peer network works, the way that transactions are broadcasted, and the way that mempools become aware of transactions, and the fact that you can sort of pin transactions based on the fee rate. And if you're dealing with a contracting setup like in Lightning, where you've got these time sensitive operations that the users might need to do, otherwise they lose their coins to an attacker, that stuff becomes really important. So again, that's it's not like something that is absolutely existential to fix, but it's something that you really want to fix. So I think, yeah, in my view, you've got those three buckets, and you kind of want to treat them with differing levels of severity.
Mm-hmm. How do you think about, because I think for most people, one of the, and I think a lot of the devs would probably class like your average pleb Bitcoiner into this, and perhaps somewhat pejoratively, but there's a recognition of the value of having an absolute in the form of money, let's say. And I think that is one of the reasons, among others, perhaps, that people are apprehensive about changing anything. It's like, look, we have this thing that's incredibly valuable, incredibly unique. Let's not mess with it. But, some change is obviously required, as you just said. And so I'm curious, like from your perspective and from your experience with other devs, I mean, how much, well, maybe a overly basic way of saying this is, how much patience should we have with the state of affairs as they are versus saying, no, like we should implement something like this now, and so this is kind of out of the category of like, oh shit, we need to make this change, otherwise things are going to be, on fire, versus like, okay, this thing's been out in the open for 14 years, and sure, maybe we can't, scale to 8 billion people right now, but things are working well enough. And how do we know that we shouldn't give it another 10 years to marinate as is, to allow above protocol levels entrepreneurial innovation to take place, to resolve some of them, to allow more adoption to take place, allow our understanding of what this thing is, and therefore how to engage it to evolve. So how do you think about having these ideas for features, let's say, that you'd like to see protocol level, and balancing that with, what if we're just being impatient?
That's a great question. And in many ways, it comes back to like engineering risk management, and that's kind of an art, right? Like, I think your instinct is absolutely right. Like, why would we rush into some kind of profound scaling solution when, right now the mempool isn't full, and right now things work okay? I think in general, that is the right disposition. I think when you start to have caveats on that is when, people who are working kind of in the trenches on Lightning are seeing like, hey, there are these attacks, there are these vulnerabilities out there that we really need to shore up, because right now maybe there isn't a huge vested interest in, say, exploiting these things, but if usage got big enough, if the channel sizes got big enough, like, these would be real problems. So I think you can start to see situations emerge where the quote unquote experts are ringing alarm bells a little bit. And I think that's like a very interesting sub exploration to get into, because groups of experts can be wrong, and groups of experts can have vested interests. Groups of experts can become myopic because they're too close to the problem. But at the same time, they're still experts. And, when you take your car to the mechanic, you're in a very difficult position, because if he says your carburetor's busted, or your fuel injection is busted, like, I mean, the best you can do, right, is get a second opinion if you're not a mechanic. And I think that's kind of, that's what this whole process is about. We have, let's be generous, and let's say we have 100 people on Earth who are car mechanics for Bitcoin's consensus, right? What's difficult about this process is that in many ways the tail wags the dog. So like the community as a whole in Bitcoin is this cascade of people kind of looking to people who are more technically savvy than they are to sort of assess a proposal, right? And ultimately, like that kind of feeds back up into the 100 people who are the car mechanics, really saying, okay, for these reasons, I think this is good or this is bad.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very difficult process, and people have kind of like a granularity of kind of ability to do a ground assessment. But everybody should always remain skeptical of the limitations of, you know, groups of experts. And I think you're seeing this in medicine right now, kind of, where you have a situation where it's like, you know what, there are a whole lot of modern medical practices that are relatively contemporary that I feel like I should ignore because you've had a technocracy emerge and come up with a bunch of solutions that are way over engineered and probably detrimental. So I'm going to ignore them.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a fine impulse, and I think that's something that we'll always have to retain as a community. I just think you kind of have to, you really have to weigh it against what you're saying is like, what's the current circumstance look like? What are the costs of maintaining the status quo? You know, for me in vaults, I look at the fact that like it's plausible to me that any exchange, even exchanges I respect, could get hacked tomorrow and lose all their coins. And like, I think that really sucks. Like, I think we could live in a world where a River or a NYDIG is in a position where it's like, oh, you know, they're doing this specific configuration of custody. And like, if things go really wrong, they're not going to lose the coins. Maybe there will be a lockup period for a month or something, but they're not going to lose the coins. So I'd like to get there. But more broadly, what you're saying is right. You have to look at what the costs are right now. And then maybe if you want to be smart, maybe you can project a little bit into the future. Maybe you can say, okay, right now we've got 40 million unique entities using Bitcoin. You know, what does the world look like if it's 200 million? Like, and if there's a run on central banks tomorrow, if there's a mass censorship event, if we get ordered by law to use CBDC, like, what is our ability to react to that from a technical perspective? Mm-hmm. Is there a plausible argument, back of the napkin math? Like, could Bitcoin carry us through that? I think like that's the analysis worth doing, and that's where the art comes in.
Yeah. You know, you brought up Nostr before. I mean, it could be something like that. I mean, it almost seems like a far more likely mass adoption event than all of our collective orange pilling efforts, you know, and people realizing the monetary significance of Bitcoin. It's like, wow, this app is top 10 in all these different jurisdictions. And very shortly, you know, a like is going to be a lightning payment or something like that. And then just, you know, a lot of people's brain just goes boom, and they're like, oh my God, well, I need to get a balance on, you know, so that I can engage in this and send payments and stuff. And then once you start doing that, you're like, oh, this shit has legs, you know, maybe I should learn more about it. And, you know, things could really take off like that. And if history is any indication, probably will happen in sequences like that, you know, where there'll be these watershed moments where, you know, cultural moments where people realize or wake up to this kind of stuff. But back to what we were discussing. I mean, how do you think Bitcoin gets defined? You know, because we're back and thinking before, and I might have even said this already, I'm not sure. Like people like yourself obviously have more ability and more knowledge and expertise about how to make changes to Bitcoin. And I was going to say that doesn't necessarily mean they know what changes should be made to Bitcoin. Now, that's a bit unfair because your closeness to it gives you more insight than most of like where it's deficient. And so that can contribute to your, you know, your notion or your perspective on how it should be changed. But I think not exclusively, right? Like normal users and people out there in the world can and do define Bitcoin for themselves, and they can have an opinion and an informed one about what Bitcoin is and what it should be. You know, and the difference is they're just not in a position to actually make it happen. So how do you, Well, I mean, maybe the right question is what is Bitcoin to you? I know that's probably a bit of a challenging question, but also secondary to that, what is the process of Bitcoin being defined? Obviously, it's part, you're part of it because here you are proposing something that will literally define, like when someone says, what is Bitcoin? Oh, it's, well, this thing. And if you lose your coins, then there's this period and you don't, so how do you define it? How do you think the process of its definition is taking place?
Just a quick note, something you said reminded me of this Hayek quote that I'm certainly going to butcher, but it's something like, the task of economics is to demonstrate to men, the failings of attempting to design what they think they can control, or something like that.
Right,
It's like,
right.
I am reminded of that with, just because you're sort of fluent with the mechanism of how a soft fork activates, that doesn't, some of these things we can't design, and no one person can hold in their head just what's going to be capable on a second layer, say. Though we can, make specific assessments about where categorically, some second layer pattern might be failing because of the base layer. But anyway, onto your question, which is like a really meaty one. What is Bitcoin? Who defines it? Who changes it? And I might glibly ask you, what is America, right? Who defines it? How has it changed? Well, with America, the corporal body maybe of America might be the documents that it was founded on. It might be, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, just in the same way that perhaps, Bitcoin source code might be those documents. And somewhat, fortunately or unfortunately, right, those are living documents. The Bill of Rights gets amended, for better and for worse, mostly for worse. Bitcoin source code gets amended, but maybe more interestingly, so you have like kind of the tangible manifestation, in these documents, but then there's a mythology, right? There's an understanding, there's an inherent worldview that's the result of generations and generations of history and cultural evolution. And that's an almost like stronger, more important binding force than the documents. I mean, really, it's hard to tell which is stronger, but like they strengthen each other, right? And they're both necessary, because if you just have the documents, well, so much of reality is, say, judicial interpretation, right?
Yeah.
Who's informing the judiciary? What ideological framework is guiding people when there's this sort of necessary ambiguity in the written form that comes up over time? And we're going to have similar situations in Bitcoin, and whether we like it or not, the tangible elements of the system can and will change. We have to make sure that there is a cultural bulwark against changes that are really really existentially challenge, the system, or really go against the nature of the system in the way that, striking the particular Bill of Rights amendment that prohibited income tax, was a profoundly negative change that runs contrary to kind of the founding distinguishing nature of America. So who controls this, right? Like, how does this play out? Well, at face value, it's really important that the constellation of fiat on and off ramps recognize some version of Bitcoin. It's really important that whatever gray, black, peer-to-peer markets exist where people are trading Bitcoin for goods, it's relevant what Bitcoin that set of people considers to be Bitcoin. It's really relevant when you decide to save in Bitcoin, what software you're running when you actually receive the Bitcoin that you've traded something for. Those are all relevant considerations. So, I wrote an internal paper at some point that wasn't released about like the power structures in Bitcoin. You've got three main constituencies. You've got sort of economic users, you've got miners, and you've got developers. And that's a very coarse way of putting it, but if you want to be coarse, kind of those are the ways to slice it up. And what Bitcoin is kind of the like spooky interaction between those three classes of entities.
That's a very interesting answer. And going back to your point about what is America and the founding documents and such, it makes me think of that notion or phrase, the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. And it's not that you exclusively adhere to one or the other. If you don't have the letter, the spirit is too malleable. It's too chaotic. If you don't have the spirit, the letter is too restrictive, is too confining. And this, I'm a big fan of Peterson. This kind of gets into that ongoing dynamic between the necessary order that can become tyrannical or stultifying, if it doesn't have that revivifying force of the chaos, of the good potential from the chaos. And civilization, human consciousness, all sorts of different systems are kind of that balance between the two. And so it's interesting to think of Bitcoin in that way. If you take the code, the protocol as being the letter, and then what is the spirit and what animates the spirit, and this is perhaps where more of the philosophical sort of discourse around Bitcoin takes place, and it perhaps is relevant, and it's not just indulgent and whatever, even though I'm sure much of it sometimes can be. Yeah, I mean, where does that spirit come from? And I think that I alluded to the value of the absoluteness before, and and I think that's part of the mythology, right? Something that cannot be changed, or at least an attribute or an element that cannot be changed, and how unique that is, but also how valuable that is. And so that's part of the guiding spirit, and perhaps that's part of the spirit that says, don't change. That's part of the spirit that tries to keep it within certain confines. But there's a question here where, well, maybe this is another one I'll put forward to you, is if Bitcoin didn't change at all from where it is today, and things were just maintained, I know a lot of people would probably say sufficient for me, and to your point, perhaps there would be an issue with everyone being able to use in a sovereign sort of way. And so there'd be centralization, and there'd be custodians, and that would come with its own risks and trade-offs. But some people would be down for that. I think, the more developer perspective would be, or to what degree do you think, if that were the case, it wouldn't be change that it would be Bitcoin's undoing, but it could be atrophy? Do you think it needs to change and evolve in order to survive long term, or could it survive as is, but it may not just become what so many of us think it has the potential to become, which is basically the base layer for value transfer for humanity? And let's hit on that. And I think there's still some meat on the bone on the spirit versus the letter thing, but I wanted to throw this at you first.
Yeah, that's the thing that keeps me up at night long term. Is my contention is, if we hit a state where, let's say, again, to be coarse here, just for expedience, to say, if members of the middle class, whatever that is, aren't able to take, maybe at some expense, physical custody of their value, of their Bitcoin, I think we're in a very dangerous position where Bitcoin has essentially, Bitcoin would develop all the same failings as gold has right now, or there may,
because
for all I know, exactly, there may be you keep all your gold in the London Exchange warehouse if you actually want to use it for commerce, and God knows there may be a robust paper market. There may be unallocated lots of physical gold where people think they actually own gold, but they don't. And centralized powers can really can paper over Bitcoin, and can introduce a de facto inflation rate if people can't kind of plausibly take possession of their coin. So that's my worry. And I have been known to be pessimistic every now and again. So the other side of that is, well, maybe even if something like that does happen, Bitcoin, the frictionlessness of Bitcoin relative to gold might allow you to get into a situation where, yes, maybe it's more centralized than it is today. Yes, maybe people of the middle class really can't take possession, but maybe we've, with something like Fedi or, like a liquid type design, maybe we've hit a situation where there's free banking to the point, like where there's enough entities keeping each other in check that we're in kind of a better situation than we are today. And kind of central banking as we know it right now isn't really practical or feasible. So like maybe there's some middle path where we could leave Bitcoin as is, but that would still, that it's not clear to me how that would work. Not that it needs to be clear to me, because I can't keep all this stuff in my head like anybody else. But I would be very worried if we started to get there without some plausible mechanism for people to be able to get their value out. I think you should always be able to get your value out and move somewhere else, because that's basically the basis of the whole system. You should be able to take possession of your value, and if there gets to be a day where that isn't the case, I worry. And I think it's possible, it's perhaps even likely, that Bitcoin needs to continue to change to get us to that place.
This one might be, well, as you said, your thought experiments about, what if, 1 billion people tried to rush in and own their own Bitcoin, sort of thing, and that would take a certain amount of time based on the parameters of Bitcoin and block space and stuff like that. I mean, how do you think that particular potential issue would be resolved? Because it's presumably a result of some of the more, fundamental or rigid components of Bitcoin's nature or protocol.
You mean in terms of like, how are we going to square the tension between, bigger block size mean it's harder to sort of validate versus sort of capacity?
Yeah, basically. I mean,
yeah.
So let's go with your example. I mean, how could 8 billion people have their own UTXO?
Right. So a lot of the reason I'm, paying attention, a lot of what's kind of captured my interest about this covenants idea, and I don't know how familiar your audience is with the whole covenants story. I won't go into it, unless you tell me you want to jump into it. But one of the potential uses of covenants is this idea of a coin pool, which is you're sharing in a trustless way, kind of similar like to a Lightning channel. You're doing a trustless share of one UTXO. And the idea is that, some number of people off chain are doing, transfers. But then you're potentially amortizing, activity between more than just two people across the transfer of one UTXO. So, I think there are a lot of open questions there. I have a little bit of skepticism in terms of being able to, facilitate the ability of any given party to kind of exit without everybody else having to recoordinate. So there's a lot of in the weeds, design discussion and proposals going on around an idea like that. You might have something like channel factories, which is a little bit of a similar idea, where you're kind of amortizing the opening of a bunch of Lightning channels over maybe a single Lightning channel. So there are a lot of ideas that people are kicking around that aren't just kind of, hey, let's increase the capacity of the block size, or hey, let's do something that compromises the ability to validate quickly, and more, in keeping with this classic Bitcoin idea of like, if me and John are, swapping, doing a lot of transfers or doing something off chain, like maybe that can just live off chain for the most part. And maybe we just go to chain if there's some kind of a dispute. So, just kind of continuing that idea, and seeing to what extent we can really like juice that concept to get as much activity off chain as we can.
Do you think there's anything about Bitcoin that should never be changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is layup, right? Like the supply.
Well, you say it's layup, but there are certain people in your community that don't hold that as sacrosanct. So I had to ask.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you're right. I mean, there are times, look, where like the technocratic part of my brain is like, oh God, what if Satoshi didn't choose the right parameters? What if the supply schedule isn't right? Oh God, couldn't we just have like 20 more years of better emissions to I don't know to what extent that stuff actually matters or it doesn't. I think my brain's not big enough to be able to figure that out. But I do know that a fundamental premise of the system, I mean, the value prop is the fixed supply. And if you start monkeying with anything even near the supply, you're just really violating the nature and the expectations that people have around having participated in this system. So I don't think that will ever change in any real way. I mean, if there's movement to, it's almost certainly going to be because Bitcoin's been very widely adopted, and the contemporary guard right now sees a way to co-opt it, and they're trying to kind of reintroduce the same monetary levers that they have right now over Bitcoin. So, I think if it ever comes to that, I'll be fighting tooth and nail, unless somehow there's really, some kind of existential thing with Bitcoin. But even then, I just think, I think you can quibble about the supply schedule. I think what's absolutely unquibblable is the cap. It's just the 21 million. That's got to be, or the system's over.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, but this is another one of those kind of like philosophical discussions where, because you could look at every component, right? The block time, how many blocks, but there's so many elements of this. 21 million. The halving cycle, all these things like, oh, well, adoption would have been better if we did this, or the economics would be slightly improved if we did this, and the security would be better if we did that. And there's so many things you could potentially change that it begs the question, like, is it not more valuable? There's a Tower of Babel metaphor in here somewhere, but is it not more valuable to subject yourself to a absolute set of constraints or parameters and force yourself to adapt to them for the value of the absolute itself, rather than tinkering until playing God, as it were, and tinkering all the way because you think this will be better and that'll be better and that'll be better, until you end up destroying the very thing that you thought that was the most valuable. And I guess the question is like, well, if you agree to that premise, and I think a lot of people probably do, it's like, well, what should be absolute, right? Like to what degree should we be subjecting ourselves to the absolute and forcing ourselves to conform around it and allow that to be the most generative, the most creative of the good, so-called, or of like the benefits that we all believe are possible here, which one should remain that way for that generative effect? And it seems your answer is, I think, the obvious one for most people. It's like, well, definitely, the supply cap, but anything else? Is it just that? Or are there other things that should not be tinkered with?
I mean, certainly, I think coin confiscation, this idea, some people have, oh, we could, fork away Satoshi's lost coins. I think, anytime you're challenging property rights within Bitcoin in any sense, I think that's just a total affront, and totally outside the bounds of polite company, really. But it's hard for me to kind of think any more specific than that. I mean, personally, I don't think the block time is so relevant. I don't think the retargeting period is so relevant. I don't think halvening is so relevant. Those things to me feel like implementation details. I'm sure there's somebody out there who can maybe give you great rationale for them, but from my perspective, they do seem kind of arbitrary.
But
So I'm not sure, but I mean,
won't they always be arbitrary? You couldn't
yeah,
change them
yeah,
in a way that would be less arbitrary.
yeah. Well, and I want to, I think my particular answers there are uninteresting. What I want to reemphasize is the interestingness of what you said, which is that maybe there certainly is kind of a sacred value in not changing things and having a really strong culture of not changing those sort of economic, those things which are kind of the externally observable manifestations of like what the Bitcoin system is for. I think there's tremendous value in not changing those things, because again, to return to the example of America, as soon as we started monkeying with the framework, I mean, in a profound way, as soon as we started to repeal and amend bills of rights, and like that's just, you're just kind of, you're starting the erosion. Really, as soon as you contradict the fundamental nature of the system, you're starting the erosion. The question that I ask myself, and like, stop me if this is too cosmic, but
Never.
it's like, what if this is, in the sort of Petersonian model of things where you've got these anabolic and catabolic forces, what if there's like a greater cycle that happens, where what if things in reality have a lifetime and systems have a lifetime, and Bitcoin may not be exempt from that. Maybe Bitcoin does exactly what we needed to do for hundreds, thousands of years, but eventually this natural process of entropy sets in the way that it's set in on America, in the way that it sets in our parents and ourselves, and they die and we die, and that might be coming. I hope it's not, and I guess we should design against that, right? And I think Bitcoin has potential to be very low entropy after a while, but in the same way that gold served us really well for thousands and thousands of years, and then Bitcoin came along and just completely displaced it. I think we shouldn't exempt ourselves from the possibility that one day that's coming for Bitcoin too. But I guess when you're making day-to-day design choices, maybe it's not such a relevant concern.
Yeah, well, we'll come back to that in 1 second, but I agree with your, again, the use of the founding documents of the US, because it's like once you start making changes and you presume to know the reason and the rationale of the changes that you're making, which is almost, I mean, again, that's so tricky because you have to appreciate there are always unknown unknowns. So your knowledge is never complete, and yet you act, right? And so it's always finding that balance between, well, is this act, is this change, is this decision sufficiently within the realm of the known and the expected to both not deleteriously affect something or catastrophically affect something, but still be enough in the realm of the unknown potential to bring about something good, because that's your whole reason for doing it in the first place. And I just, humility is the word that comes to mind for navigating that properly. Anytime there's too much arrogance, hubris, all that kind of stuff, much of which characterizes the scientific circumstance that we find ourselves in the world today, you're going to make so many wrong decisions where you're going to bring about, probably you're going to do more harm than good, because you're not sufficiently humble, you're not sufficiently appreciating the unknown unknowns, you're ascribing too much knowledge to yourself, and you're just going to fuck shit up.
Right.
And it's how do you find that balance? And your example with the amendments, I mean, one of the things that comes to mind is, and has come to mind before, is like, to what extent does normalizing change or normalizing the frequency of change may not affect you in a negative way in the short term, but does so in the long term? So this kind of goes back to our or a question about like, what were soft forks like before Segwit and after? If they become normalized and there's not this like incredibly contentious aura around them, then do they become less and less and less contentious to become more and more and more frequent? And then, oops, on one, we really fuck things up and we can't go back. Or someone saw that and it became more easy to co-opt, or whatever the case may be. Like it's, and again, I don't know what the answer is there, because as we said before, I mean, there's this tension between the spirit and the letter, and you're always trying to navigate that. But it seems like at least a component of navigating that properly is subjecting yourself to something absolute. And of course, this goes off, and you talk about going cosmic. I mean, this brings us right into the realm of the religious and the philosophical domain, because that's primarily what that deals with. And a lot of people just shrug that off as, you know, superstitious nonsense. But I think it's been central to human civilization forever, because there's a recognition of the value of subordinating yourself to something absolute, for the humility that inculcates in how you make those decisions. And so, you know, that's a question that we have to contend with in terms of making changes to Bitcoin, it seems.
Absolutely. And so for myself, you know, I think there are two kind of guiding principles when I think about changing Bitcoin. You know, number one is kind of non-contagion. So I think if you want to make a change to the consensus, you have to do it in such a way that you ensure that, you know, people who want to interact with this new change, any failure there isn't going to spill over into the rest of the system. And obviously that's, you know, that can be a little bit difficult to reason about. But I think the second thing is that you really, you know, property rights are sacrosanct. And I think we have to develop, if we're going to win here, we have to develop an extreme sensitivity to being able to root out when property rights are being challenged or at risk within Bitcoin, versus things that are really more just kind of like procedural. It's like if I, you know, with like check lock time verify, like that's not challenging anybody's property rights. That's just saying, hey, we introduced kind of an additional tool constraint that people who want to write contracts can introduce if they want to. And there's not, you know, there's no externality on the ability of people to validate. There's no, you know, risk of that spilling over into some unrelated, you know, existing coin. So I think what's really key for us, and it really, I mean, it goes back to what you're emphasizing about the spiritual or religious, you know, or far-sighted like nature of building up this culture and preserving the culture and not letting the culture degrade in the same way that we don't let the software, the source code, the documents, the tangible manifestation of the system degrade. You have to do that same thing in culture, because culture is what keeps people able to discern between changes that say compromise the property rights versus changes that are well isolated and, you know, big, you know, value adds. So it's and that's tough, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's partially tough because nobody decides what the culture is going to be. You know, if anything, the thing around which we are coalescing, the thing, you know, you used the word sacred a few moments ago in relation to the 21 million hard cap. And I suspect you use that in a somewhat of a tongue-in-cheek way, maybe not in the traditional use of the word, but here it is showing up in your selection of words to use. And I think, you know, that's kind of speaks. So we're all kind of coming around this thing religiously. We're kind of treating it in that way, in the certain, and, you know, so it really begs the question, like, what is the right approach to take to that? And I think the question about culture is not so much that, well, we do create it, but we can only control our own contribution to it. I think the thing that most influences it, you know, and Saif has written a lot about this in his whole, you know, fiat sound money dichotomy. Whatever you might think about that, it certainly seems to be reasonable to suggest that the thing that people deem most meaningful, that is going to go a long way into inculcating in them something that contributes to the culture, right? Because if it's so meaningful, they're going to be looking to that thing for some kind of guidance, whether it is a religious hierarchy in the notion of God, or whether it is socioeconomic intersubjective absolute, like a money. They'll be looking at the attributes of those things, and the very process of everyone else valuing it in a similar way is going to elevate those aspects that people perceive in them. And so we might say in Bitcoin, we perceive truth. We perceive that Bitcoin property, inalienable property rights, you can't be stolen from. The protocol can't be violated. And these things end up bleeding out into, well, if you take them into your own life, it's like, well, honesty and respect and well, don't lie, cheat, and steal, all the normal ones. I mean, you could very easily see the connection between attributes in this thing that everyone is so-called worshiping and their manifestation in people's behavior. And so in that way, you can see how this thing is actually probably the dominant force in generating the culture, which I think a lot of us would say, great, wouldn't you want something that has as its kind of highest ideals, truth and freedom and honesty and property rights and else, perhaps much else more, but wouldn't you want those things to be the fundamental constituents of what generates the culture? Because I think we all agree, like, those are the things that are most generative, back to how we started this, of in our critique of Canada, of a stable, prosperous, peaceful culture. And so I think that's the primary force. And then we all must take it upon ourselves. And this also alludes back to what I was saying about talking to so many pleb Bitcoiners on this show, to almost represent those ideals. You see them there, you see the value of them, you see what the market is saying about their value. Why not see how much value they accrue to you if you engage them, if you embody them? And again, we're getting cosmic here, because this is kind of, there's a lot of overlap between doing that with something like Bitcoin and doing that with something like your perception or your notion of a religious character or figure or God or something like that. And this is also why I think, coming back to this notion of humility, I don't want to stereotype or go too broad brushstrokes here, but I think there's probably a more of an inclination in the technical community, let's say, or technically minded people, to say, this is just a tool. It has nothing to do with belief systems. So let's just treat it as such. And my response, when I see those comments, I always think, nothing is just a tool. Mm-hmm. As soon as you find a utility in the so-called tool, that's connecting to all of your values, up to whatever generates the most of them. What do you hold as the highest values? Maybe it's truth, maybe it's freedom, maybe it's love, maybe it's whatever. The utility that generates the utility you see in something, because it's that utility is saying to you, oh, this can help you move closer to the thing that is of greatest value to you. This thing can help you move closer to the thing that's greatest meaning to you. So you can't tell me that any tool has nothing to do with belief systems. Every tool has everything to do with belief systems. And the reason why I bring that up is not just to shit on like overly technically minded people, but it's to say, I think that's also part of the element that will, hate to keep using the word, but will inculcate the requisite humility to approach something of incredible value properly, and not allow arrogance and hubris and thinking you see the full picture to cause you to engage it improperly, and possibly harm it or destroy it.
That's right. And what you say reminds me of that old Marshall McLuhan quote, which is, "We shape our tools and our tools shape us." Right. It's a circular, bi-directional thing. And I mean, that's really true of all, almost everything in life. I hadn't, before you said that, I hadn't really made the connection between preserving the stated values of Bitcoin in work, and then having that kind of feedback and reinforce, the characteristics that we want to see in ourselves, truth, honesty, integrity. I think that's a beautiful idea, and I hope we can live up to it.
Yeah, me too. Um, One of the things that has perhaps been absent from this discussion that, again, I think is important, if to the extent we consider making changes to Bitcoin, if you think such things are potentially valid, um, how should one be considering the risks that are involved in that? And so there's obviously two questions here. One is the specific risks of any change or upgrade, like with vaults and making certain payments like conditional, or impairing them in some way, and like what are the considerations for fungibility and all that kind of stuff. But I think those people can kind of go down on those if they want, and look at white papers and look at discussion that's happening on them. I'm more interested in, and this is kind of counterintuitive or whatever, but I'm more interested in the how we ascribe a level of risk to the unknown unknowns. So when we're considering making changes at all, aside from the specific implementation or the specific upgrade, how should we be conceptualizing? And because I think back, what we were saying about the deference to the experts here and how that's, well, unavoidable, but also potentially detrimental. I think that this is one of the things that myself and many others probably need greater clarity on. We all want Bitcoin to succeed. The tension is, well, you think it succeeds by doing X, Y, Z, and I think it succeeds by doing A, B, C. And to what degree is that tension simply a matter of us not considering the same things? And so I'm curious about how one should be thinking about risks and contending with unknown risks to any upgrade.
Yeah. So I think probably, if I can clarify your question, I would guess is less about sort of the technical approach to gauging the impact of a specific change, in the way that, like, for example, we do something called fuzz testing in software, where we create some kind of component and then we use a random generator to just absolutely hammer the thing with random input and see how it behaves, right? And the idea is that this fuzzer has its own algorithm for determining how to feed in random inputs that will exercise the entirety of the functionality, right? So at a technical level, like, certain things are easier or harder to fuzz. And so that's almost your technical basis for saying, like, what's the open-ended risk of this thing? Can I comprehensively exhaust the potential actions that the code can actually perform here? What's interesting is you can, like, take that approach and kind of scale it up a layer to almost the social layer, the end use layer. It's like, if I introduce this functionality into Bitcoin, how hard is it to get your arms around, like, what the total set of possible uses of this thing is, and certain changes are easier and certain changes are harder. I think one interesting case study here, so to take, like, the one end of the spectrum, which I think Vaults lives on, is like check lock time verify. Like, what are all the possible uses someone could come up with for check lock time verify? Well, it turns out that's pretty easy to reason about because it's kind of a narrow set of functionality. On the and I think Opvault lives there for the most part. On the other hand, it's entertaining to look at something like multisig, right? Why should Bitcoin have multisig? Because if we were sitting here assessing multisig, it's like, well, we could enter a situation where Coinbase will only give me my Bitcoin if it's in a 2 of 3 multisig where the Treasury Department, or a 2 of 2 multisig where the Treasury Department's one leg of that. Like, that could be a horrible usage that's an attack on Bitcoin. Obviously, we have multisig because it's amazingly useful, and the use sort of outweighs that possibility, along with the fact that an attack like that's, like, hard to do for a few reasons. But one interesting example that is in the news a lot lately now is this Ordinal stuff. Inscriptions, and the way that Taproot has kind of enabled, or quote unquote enabled that use.
Made it easier, perhaps, is the gist I'm getting.
That's right. And I think Andrew Polstra had a very insightful and brief post on the mailing list about this, which I encourage people to seek out, because the point is, if people want to embed data on the blockchain, they're going to do it. They're going to figure out a way to do it. there are more and less efficient ways to do it. Probably the least costly way to do it is this Taproot thing. And when I say costly, I mean costly to validation. The sort of costly in terms of the externality to people who just want to validate their nodes. Because you can actually cleave off conceptually, you can cleave off the data people are embedding there versus if you were to hide data in signatures or something like that, which are very expensive to validate and store. On the other hand, I mean, you can make the argument that like Segwit introduced this witness discount, and it made it, in some sense cheaper, quote unquote, to embed large data in these witnesses. And then that gets into a kind of a bigger conversation about like, is it good that there's an impetus for a fee market? Is someone
what do you mean an impetus for a fee market?
Right. So my belief right now is that, like, I think any demand for block space right now is very good, wherever that demand comes from, because I worry about the miners, basically. I like seeing security spend come through in the form of fees versus the subsidy, because that's what's going to kind of sustain the system for a long time. So I kind of like seeing that come in one way or another. But maybe the more interesting question to me is, conceptually, is someone sticking some data on the blockchain really any different or more objectionable than someone making payments that you don't like or care about? Is that really so different from commerce that you don't morally kind of agree with the premise of happening on Bitcoin? And my answer is, well, in either case, they're kind of inevitable. And in one sense, if you make one cheap, the other becomes cheap, because, as we're fond of pointing out, Bitcoin is just data. Bitcoin is just speech. It's just speech. And, facilitating one kind of speech kind of by nature facilitates the other kind of speech. So to me, the notion of spam is just like what doesn't pay the market clearing fee rate, because I'm not in a position to morally adjudicate the flow of value on Bitcoin. And if someone wants to spend their Bitcoin to use the chain a certain way, it's almost fungible to me.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this particular issue represents any greater long-term risks or consequences? Because I think most people would agree with what you just said. I mean, pay your fee and have at it, right? But do you think it represents any other threats?
Not that I can see right now. Only because I think, I think the inscription design is, like, personally, Casey's a really smart guy. I'm really glad he's in Bitcoin. I like him personally. I think, inscriptions specifically within the ordinals thing it's just kind of dumb. It's going to flame out. Maybe you have a super long tail niche marketplace in the same way that people sell Warhol paintings. Like, maybe that kind of persists on Bitcoin. But my belief is that this design, where you're actually putting data into the blockchain, is like it just prices itself out very, very, very quickly. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know that it represents to me, like, it, again, it's not one of these things that keeps me up at night.
Do you kind of went through the trajectory of this, Segwit enabled, Taproot enabled this. Does this represent or not, and this is total genuine question because I don't know the answer, but each successive change, 99% might be as intended, and then 1% is, oh, we didn't really see that being possible, or that change. And maybe for one upgrade, that's fine. It's inconsequential. But if you string 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 together, and you you're building a chain of unintended consequences. I can already, I don't think there's an easy answer to this question, or if at all, but it kind of goes back to my question of like, how is it possible to contend with or conceptualize, or to whatever degree assess the risks of unknown unknowns? I mean, again, by default, it's unknowable, but if you're going to be making changes to something so fundamental and so valuable, it feels like there should at least be some kind of heuristic or some kind of way of thinking about it.
Yeah, that's right. So in nuclear design, in aerospace design, they have very specialized techniques for gauging redundancy, right? So you should never be in a position where one component within the system can fail and cause, huge downstream failures that result in loss of life. Bitcoin, like, you could make the claim that it has the opposite problem, where it's like, if you introduce too many components that could be used together in some way, maybe, okay, you blow up the system. I think on the one hand, like, maybe that's possible in some sense, but I think I can say, just kind of based on the engineering culture in Bitcoin, the first question that people usually go to is like, what's the pathological use of this new thing you're proposing? Like, what is the most crazy, harmful thing, that could be done? Because really, in the Bitcoin culture, rightfully so, like, pointing something like that out, like, wins you a lot of credibility and reputation, and it should, right? Because that's the whole name of the game. But I do think there is typically an emphasis on, like, what's the pathological case here? What's the worst that can happen? And I mean, again, like with the Taproot example, it's like, okay, either you want the ability to do, say, large multisigs, or you want the ability to embed large witness data, which to be clear, could eventually get us to a day where transaction data and signatures are slammed together in such a way that we have incredible gains for fungibility, privacy, efficiency. That design choice within Taproot of removing the 10,000 byte script limit, like, wasn't just kind of done out of nowhere. So it's hard to do that. Like we both understand, it's really hard to do that projection. You need to try and do that projection. You need to err on the side of not enabling, failure, spillover, and you need to be thinking about the pathological cases.
This may not be the most concise closer, but we're at time, so I'll let you go now. But what in your mind is the biggest risk, or risks, if kind of they're equal in your mind, to Bitcoin? And I guess also, because I listened to your chat with Marty, and you were at the end, maybe I wouldn't say bearish, but there was obviously there's things that concern you, let's say. But what are you most hopeful about? Like, what kind of, we kick this off by saying how Bitcoin invigorates people, in a number of different areas for a number of different reasons. What is most invigorating about it to you, and how is that directing your behavior?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in some ways, it's the thing with being pessimistic and morose is, like, you can give very particular things that you're worried about. With this question, I mean, look, from almost as early as I can remember, I've been sort of a frustrated libertarian, and I've been really concerned with individual rights, and I mean, geez, arguing with people in my college dorm room about libertarian ideas. As I joke that, like, Bitcoin is like the dividend that ultimately paid, because it was so annoying.
Right, and you didn't get any satisfaction when you were having the debates.
No, it's like alienating and very frustrating, because you're like, how could you not see this? How can you not understand that, like, top-down control is really not great? So, I mean, look, this notion that Bitcoin could be a substrate for this new, more free world that we're making. I mean, it's even when I have these concerns that are fun to talk about, on podcasts. I mean, look, I keep getting out of bed for this stuff. And the thought of returning to work on something less potentially valuable to me is like almost unthinkable. It would have to be something like, going to work on nuclear energy, which has like its own set of, impossibilities, mostly regulatory, to sort of overcome. It would have to be something like of profound value to even begin to equate to this idea that you're potentially working on the substrate for human freedom, and prosperity. I mean, I shouldn't even say prosperity, because that sounds so vague and, aggrandizing. But I mean, I really think that if Bitcoin carries out its design goals, I mean, the world is going to be unrecognizable in a very nice way. And so that keeps me going. And, even when I get bearish on whatever it is, I mean, it's almost like arguing about the spouse that you really love, or like griping about your spouse that you love. It's like, yeah, you're married, and you can go out to beers with your buddies and whatever, but like you love them deeply, and I feel the same way.
You ain't going nowhere. You just
I ain't going
you got to air out some stuff every now and then.
Yeah, exactly.
That's one of the topics I love to delve into with all this, is because of how influential we know this thing is on consciousness, basically on our perspective on how it changes so many things. When we think of that future that we deem to be, where there's more opportunity, where it's more prosperous, what does prosperity even mean in that future? I mean, we started this off with you saying, like, there's an element to you that you want to be more independent and sovereign. And, so I imagine that means you're prioritizing sovereign access to food, energy, what have you, versus, the trite material things that you might pick up at Walmart or the Lambos or whatever. And so clearly you're assigning your definition of prosperity and wealth is different than people that would be scooping up the ladder, let's say. And so it's very interesting to me to speculate, like, if it becomes more and more adopted, prevalent, distributed, the dominant value transfer layer of the world, and all these things some of the things that we've touched on today, what does prosperity mean? I think a lot of us in today's world, with the way things are, we think starships and wormholes and colonies on Mars. That's progress. That's wealth. And that it may be, I love that shit too. It's super interesting. But maybe we will define wealth and progress and prosperity, or we'll weight other things more than we currently do. And maybe they'll be intangibles. Maybe they'll be intangibles.
John, when I say unrecognizable, unfortunately, what I mean by that is like widespread availability of like a single family home, and like stability of the family. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about, because I think
crazy outlandish shit.
Yeah, right. Like from a human perspective, it kind of doesn't get much better. I've worked with people who are like billionaires, and they want fundamentally the same things that you and I want, which is to have a family that they love, to be surrounded by friends that they like, to do work that invigorates them and that they believe in, and fundamentally, if you have those things, like, life just kind of doesn't get much better. So I think that's all we want. I mean, what worries me, and not to prolong the discussion too much, but look, what worries me is that for massive technological adoption to happen, I think there has to be sort of an order of magnitude improvement in the value prop of the technology. And what I really worry is that, for Bitcoin, that ain't user experience. Like, it's not fun to use Bitcoin sometimes. I mean, sometimes it's really fun to use Bitcoin, but if you're trying to get your mom to, use Bitcoin in a self-sovereign way, that's really tough. And what I worry about is that what's going to catalyze, what's going to show to people Bitcoin's value is going to be a set of circumstances that is really very dark,
right.
And really not a fun time for us. And I think humanity's got a bit of a debt to pay down sort of literally and figuratively. And I think we, if things go a certain way, like our life is a little bit going to be about shouldering that debt coming home to roost. And I don't want to be glib, and it's very easy to talk brave, before things like this happen. But I think it could, it may not be fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the sobering realization that a lot of people who've given sufficient thought to what this chessboard looks like, they've had to have at least considered that possibility. And, we were talking earlier about how the different ways you're thinking about the implications of Bitcoin can engender in you certain emotions, be it hope, enthusiasm, stimulation, but it also engenders those. And, again, this will be my last comment, I promise, but you talked about, even though sometimes you're a bit morose, there's still nothing more meaningful in your life than this, and you're completely devoted to it. And I don't, I don't draw these connections to be provocative in any way, but I think it can be instructive, and it can help guide us in looking just at the language used in the religious domain and how we're treating this thing. And I know people calling Bitcoin a cult and religion is usually used in a pejorative manner, but I think if we can, remove a lot of the baggage around that phenomenon, let's say the religious phenomenon of theology, like I think there's a lot to it in terms of how you approach the thing that is most meaningful to you. And another one, and I hate to be like as morose as it gets right now, but it's like there's this idea of, we mentioned earlier, can you subordinate yourself to something rather, because you recognize that's the way to get the most out of it, but that is also simultaneously a humbling thing. And are you capable of seeing the value in that and, finding the balance and doing that properly? Another one, obvious religious notion, is that of sacrifice. Now, you could take that, the ultimate sacrifice, or you could step back a few steps, and you sacrifice every day when you work on Bitcoin. You sacrifice time with your friends and your family and out in nature and playing video games and doing all the other things you'd want to do. Those are little micro sacrifices. And again, I think a lot of Bitcoiners have realized that we're in these very, maybe unique's not the right word, but times that may test our faith in a weird way. It's like, well, how much are you willing to give to this thing? And I don't want to answer that question on the ultimate domain. Nobody does, because First of all, how can you until you're in that circumstance? And none of us want to consider that. But even, you're a Bitcoin developer, very conceivable that in the future there's a not so great spotlight or eye of Sauron on you, and people and the system or the forces that prevail would want to isolate you, pressure you, do things that would make you give up on your work, basically. And and so the question is, well, how much am I willing to sacrifice to continue that? How important is it to me? And I don't have any answers here, but just to I think it's that framing is obvious to me, and so it causes these, it places a emphasis and a seriousness on just how meaningful all this is, and what you're willing to do, and perhaps a little bit more positively, who you're willing to become to contend with those things. And I think that's the really interesting and the really positive and productive aspect of the tension of the times that we're in, is that people seem to be on the process, but also willing to continue on that process of rising to whatever occasion is necessary to see this through. And what could be more uplifting than that? Because it seems to me that that's how you get those good outcomes. It's when people are so doggedly principled or adherent to certain values, again, as we were discussing earlier in the case of Canada, that they're willing to go all the way to preserve them. And it's like, it's almost seems like it's how reality works is like it requires that level of dedication and sacrifice to get them and to maintain them. And so, maybe you're right. And, obviously I hope you're wrong, just like everybody else does. It would be great if this happened the easy way.
Totally.
But even if it doesn't, even if the big cataclysm or pushback doesn't happen, I think all of us are going to continue to contend with at least the internal struggle and tension of transforming into someone who's more capable and more appreciative and more able to engage what's happening here on the best possible terms. And we all grew up in the industrial education system and all the fiat incentives that prevailed up until this point in history. And I think that means it's going to be a necessity to continually engage that process of transformation. And ultimately, I think it would be good, but change can sometimes be uncomfortable, and that's what we all have to contend with.
Well said, my friend. I think anything I could follow that on with would just be a more clunky reframing of what you got across there. So yeah, it's a process, and we all have to go through it daily, and just
totally
get ready for whatever comes.
Absolutely. Well, look, I've taken up enough of your time. We'll have to do this again because there's a lot of additional stuff I'm sure we could touch on. But is there any final words? Did you want to direct people to learn more? We didn't really talk about OpVault, so if people want to learn more about that, the destinations they can go to learn more about it.
Yeah, that's been discussed elsewhere, so I think we weren't missing too much. But if you want to find me on Twitter, I'm at JamesOB, and all the Vault stuff's posted there. But I want to thank you for having me on. I really, really enjoyed this. Love talking to you always. So yeah, I do hope we can do it again soon.
Yeah. Likewise, brother. Take care.
All right, man. I'll see you.
See ya.